Welcome to FHADA's webinar series, Special Current Events Briefing. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to review the logistics of today's webinar. All attendees' cameras and microphones will be muted throughout the event. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. At any time during the session, please use the Q&A link in the toolbar to submit your questions. Note that we will not be using the chat feature to review questions, so please don't use that. Use the Q&A link. We'll be recording the session and make it available on FHADA's website after the webinar. And as a reminder, the discussions in this session are not for media use. For quotes and more information, please contact FHADA directly. We'd now like to introduce FHADA Executive Director Tim Kaiser, who will discuss today's agenda.
Good day, everybody. Thank you for taking some time to join us for the next 75 minutes or so. We're very happy to present this current events session. There's a lot happening in Washington. We thought this would be a good time to talk about some of the major topics which are up there on your screen. These are the issues we want to give you some information on today. And we're going to use a little bit of a different format as we talk about these topics: infrastructure and appropriations, fair housing, the disparate impact rule, and some of the others listed up there. Instead of a straight presentation, we thought it would be more interesting to do this in a more conversational manner. So we're going to do that with the FHADA staff. And I'm pleased that the FHADA staff was able to join us for this. I think they're the best team in the industry. That consists of Jim Armstrong, Arlene Kahn, and David Weber. We're delighted to be joined by our special guest stars, and I mean guest stars, Crystal Wojciechowski and Jonathan Zimmerman, who've been with FHADA previously and continue to do a lot of work and great work with the organization. So with that, let's jump right into some of the hot topics, and please think about questions you have and send them in, as Blake said, on the Q&A, and we'll try to get to those. But let's talk about the budget situation and appropriations. Arlene, when we had the FHADA meeting in May, at that time, we only had a budget outline. There weren't many details. Since the FHADA May meeting, though, we have a fuller budget proposed by President Biden, and now a House Appropriations bill, which you just did an alert on the other day. So can you just quickly outline some of the brief highlights in the budget and the House Appropriations bill?
Yeah, sure. So the White House budget had some great news for the HUD budget, close to full funding for operating, nearly 16% increase for capital fund, full funding for HAP renewals, and near full funding for admin fees, with a really huge increase of 29% from FY21. The budget also includes $1.6 billion. This is the Biden budget, for 200,000 incremental vouchers. And those are particularly for those who are homeless, fleeing domestic violence, or to provide mobility related services to moving to higher opportunity neighborhoods. But the House budget, which we saw this week, calls for $1 billion in funding and 125,000 vouchers. And we're going to hear more about that later from Jonathan. The House budget, which we should mention is not final yet, it's just been referred from the subcommittee to the full committee, has some pretty comparable numbers to the White House budget, with full funding of voucher renewals, near full funding for operating, but actually 10 million more than the White House budget and 33 million more than last year. One higher significant number was the capital fund at $3.4 billion. So that's 200 million more than the president's budget, and really symbolic because that is the number cited in the we often cite that number from the 2010 HUD apt report, which is necessary to meet annual capital needs. You know, recognizing that goes back to 2010 and that's not, you know, adjusted for inflation. But the major disappointment was in the account for admin fees, because the House budget was $321 million less than the White House budget, but still 300 million more than last year, or
Right.
a 13.8% increase.
Right.
So, yeah, so that's still very significant, especially, when we know that we might see a higher number after the Senate releases its own budget.
Right. So, yeah, Arlene, you mentioned a lot of numbers, and I should point out to the audience that we have linked to the webinar a number of FHADA materials, newsletters, position papers, the alert that you did the other day, which goes into all the specific numbers. So I know it's sometimes hard to follow when you're talking about all these numbers, but I would urge members to go to those links and review the documents for more information. Arlene, you mentioned the admin fee situation, and I understand the reduction compared to the Biden proposed budget, but the admin fees that we're seeing of late are much better than, we saw. You and I used to really lament the fact that we were getting admin fees in the low 70% range. But how do you account for the increase in the admin fees in the Section 8 account?
So this 29% is huge, and I think unexpected by all of us. And I think some of us, including you, think that we're seeing the results of our sustained advocacy. I've been at FHADA for 4 years, and it is one of the main accounts that we fight for. We meet with congressional staff and show them the many things that housing authorities do with the admin fees. We explain that they need that for staff. It's not some special fee. It actually pays work that needs to be done on the program. And so I think what we saw in the CARES Act immediately, significant funding, $850 million for admin fees. And that told us, and we've been saying to HUD and Congress, it shows that they do understand that we need those fees to run programs, because we saw that with CARES. So I think we're in pretty good shape, even with it. Maybe we're only going to be at a 96 or 7% proration. We'll know soon. But compared to 7 and 80s, as you mentioned, that's so much better.
Right. So Arlene, what do you think, based on our conversations? Can you tell the audience what we think we'll be looking at as far as timing on FY22 final appropriations?
Sure. Well, we're unlikely to see a budget before September 30th, when the fiscal year ends.
Surprise, right?
Yeah, big surprise to our audience too, because this has been the same for the last 4 years. And this year it seems to be worse, because with the new administration, there was a late start, and we have some other things competing with the budget process that have been in the news, and we'll talk about them. But so we've been hearing that there will definitely be a continuing resolution, because everything isn't going to get resolved by the end of September, and that one staff even said we may go well into FY22 into March. But we've also heard one of the significant hurdles with the budget is that the Biden budget has a 1% increase for defense and a 16% increase for non-defense discretionary, which includes the HUD budget. So if it's very likely those numbers won't stand. Republicans don't accept that construct, and if those numbers change, it will probably affect the HUD budget.
I think you're absolutely right. As you noted, very small increase for defense spending, and even many Democrats want to see more for defense spending in the coming fiscal year. So I think that is going to be a significant issue going forward. Right. And of course, the margins, the voting margins, you have 50-50 in the Senate, with the vice president breaking a tie, and then a very close voting margin of less than 10 votes in the House of Representatives as well. So
exactly. Yeah, and the gulf between the most progressive senators who don't mind more debt and those who want to know how everything will be paid for is significant. And speaking of that, we do know from congressional staff that just to keep pace with inflation, between $3 to $4 billion is needed for public housing, Section 8, and PBRA. Yet there's only $1.2 billion available from the source that typically pays for these increases, which is the FHA receipts. So right there, there's a problem, and we've been
Yeah.
told to manage our expectations.
Right, right. Yes, and we've had some good recent conversations with appropriations staff. Arlene, another major topic related to the budget is the infrastructure plan and housing as an element of that. There's a couple of different plans, a lot of political and economic dynamics occurring. Can you just briefly discuss that situation?
Sure. So the infrastructure plan that the president put out is about $4.4 trillion. And that's the one that everyone has heard includes the $40 billion for the capital fund, which is a little disappointing because we've been advocating for 70 billion, but still to have a figure such as 40 billion is pretty amazing. In addition to that plan, there are 22 so-called center senators who've been working for a much smaller, more traditional infrastructure plan. And that doesn't include the 40 billion in capital funding or some of the other housing elements that we've mentioned in the past, including LIHTC. And but the housing components of the Biden plan will be what we think that they'll be part of a reconciliation plan, which we're seeing in the Senate. The Democrats have been working on that for the last few weeks. And yesterday we just saw that they agreed to a top line number of 3.5 trillion. So we don't know how that's going to affect the capital fund. Likely there will be cuts in all of Biden's numbers. We're seeing that, and it's being said even by Chuck Schumer, who's the party's leader, and so we don't know what's going to happen with the reconciliation attempt. Even though this process only requires 50 votes as opposed to the 60 normally required, to get 50 votes, they need every Democrat to vote in favor. And as you alluded to earlier, the vice president could break that tie. But we have some more centrist Democratic senators like Joe Manchin, who did say today he's open to that plan, but wants to see all the details as to how it will be paid for. And then we have progressives like Bernie Sanders, who wanted a $6 trillion bill,
Right.
And others in the House supporting that. So, where that other $2 trillion goes and what's used to pay for that versus housing, we don't know how that will all fall out. So we will see more of this over the next few weeks. Schumer has said he wants to finish this next week and bring a vote to the
Right.
So we'll see what happens.
Just getting a reconciliation bill through the Congress, as we mentioned, with the voting margins so slim, will be very difficult. I know they did it previously with the COVID relief package, but it's not an easy process to replicate. So we'll see. I think one main message I want to convey to everyone out there, and we've been trying to, reiterate in our newsletter and elsewhere, and that is, please contact your senators and your representatives. This capital fund infrastructure package of potentially $40 to $80 billion is a once in a lifetime opportunity to address the backlog that we have in the industry. So please contact your senators, your congressmen. Use the FADA infrastructure paper linked to this webinar. It's on our website. It's urgently needed. Please do that. So Arlene, before I turn to fair housing and Jim Armstrong, any other things you want to add on the budget?
No, I just say get your popcorn, members. It's going to be an interesting fight over the next few weeks or months.
Yeah,
to see how this all pans out.
definitely. So Jim Armstrong, who I think is the industry's best policy analyst on fair housing, bar none. Can you take a moment, Jim? The department recently put out a new fair housing rule and just briefly explain it in comparison to some of the earlier iterations we've seen from Presidents Obama and Trump.
I can certainly try.
And you have 1 minute, Jim.
Right. So on June 10th, the department published a fair housing rule change. As you may remember, in 2020, the prior administration published both a final disparate impact rule and also a final fair housing rule, which they called preserving community and neighborhood choice or something like that. Which had the effect essentially of dismantling most of the federal government's capacity to enforce the Fair Housing Act. Early in the Obama administration, the president put out an executive order and a notice that they were going to make significant revisions to this as quickly as they could. So this is the first step that they've taken, this June 10th publication, first step they've taken to do that. What they have done is taken several of the definitions that the 2020 final rules had removed from regulation and put them back in. And their definitions of who has to submit assessments of fair housing or some analysis of fair housing. And it also includes definitions concerning what the certifications of affirmatively furthering fair housing mean. The department has at the beginning of its rule a pretty thorough discussion of 10 or 12 years of history, both judicial and administrative, with these definitions and with this rulemaking. So one of the reasons that they wanted to get this rule out quickly, and they published this as an interim final rule, so it will become effective after the end of July. It'll be effective as of August 1st. And one of the reasons they felt it was important to do that is because localities and states who have to submit consolidated plans this year have to have those plans in by sometime around the middle of August. And so they wanted to publish some guidance concerning the definitions of the certifications that localities and states were having to make in connection with their consolidated plans. They were accepting comments concerning this publication, and we submitted comments along with, at the moment, there are about 50 comments published on the federal government's website. And we submitted comments essentially supporting most of what the department was trying to do, with a couple of exceptions. The definitions from 2015 were troubling to FHADA because for the first time, it included housing authorities as so-called program participants who would be required to submit some form of analysis of fair housing to the department. This is the first time ever that housing authorities were required to do that. Previously, housing authorities had in their annual PHA plans had to certify that the plans that they were submitting were consistent with a consolidated plan of their locality or their state, but didn't have to carry out their own analysis of fair housing. It's unclear from the changes HUD published on June 10th whether that changes or not at the present time. So when you say what's up with fair housing, it's a little difficult to untangle.
Yeah.
In its notice, the department has promised to make some technical guidance available by the end of this month. Okay. And so hopefully there will be additional information on what exactly the impacts of these initial changes are for people who have to certify to affirmatively furthering fair housing, and also people who have to prepare those analyses, and guidance maybe concerning whether housing authorities fall into that group of folks.
So Jim, what I've asked you recently, is this a better rule than what we've seen proposed by the previous two administrations? You've said, well, we don't necessarily know, but
right.
Please,
I think the biggest issue that we face is what sort of requirements are going to be imposed on housing authorities that may be different from the requirements housing authorities had to comply with between, say, 1996 and 2015. Okay. There have been a number of so-called assessments of fair housing that have been submitted both before and after the prior administration suspended that requirement. A number of housing authorities, there may be 20 to 30 of those submitted so far. And a number of those were submitted jointly between localities and housing authorities. So a number of housing authorities have chosen to collaborate with their localities on preparing this analysis, which probably is a very good idea model for everybody to try to do, to stay in touch with localities and participate as fully as you're able to and need to in the development of analyses of fair housing that governments are conducting with their consolidated planning. Okay. And hopefully, fingers crossed, the department will come up with a way for housing authorities to comply with their certification and their requirement to affirmatively furthering fair housing that is much less burdensome than what the Obama administration had published as a final rule in 2015.
So that rule that required agencies to look at things like access to jobs and
Correct.
Education and
The
transportation.
quality of education, transportation,
Right.
infrastructure, all of those kinds of things,
Yeah.
zoning requirements and things that are outside of their control and their areas of expertise.
And I will say that we met recently with FHEO staff, you and I and others,
Right.
and we conveyed to them that we don't believe that agencies should be held accountable or have to report on those things
Right.
in any forthcoming rule.
And I will say that the tone of the discussion in the June 10th interim final rule is fairly positive. In other words, they seem to understand that the 2015 requirements imposed on housing authorities really need to be revisited. I'll also mention, I want to thank Jonathan Zimmerman for sending material around, but at a meeting yesterday, Phil Tegler with the Policy Race Research Action Council made a presentation in which he explicitly advocated for a simplified, less burdensome, more targeted approach to housing authorities' requirements under affirmatively furthering fair housing. And Phil Tegler has always been one of the most vigorous advocates for rigorous enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. And so if we have Phil Tegler advocating for a less burdensome process, and we have this positive tone coming out of the department, I'm somewhat optimistic that we may be able to dodge the bullet that we were facing with assessments of fair housing back in 2015.
Okay, I want to point out before we get to the other related topic, again, all of the materials on fair housing, our comments are linked to this webinar. Jim, related to this is the disparate impact rule. Take just a couple of minutes because we do need to move on to the next topic soon.
Sure.
Well, David wants to interject something after, but just briefly mention the disparate impact proposed rule as well.
Sure. So in 2013, the department, under the Obama administration, published a final disparate impact regulation, which they claimed was including in regulation standards that the courts had approved. There were a number of questions that were still very, very much open within the courts. And in 2015, the Supreme Court weighed in with its inclusive communities decision. We did not think that HUD's 2013 rule exactly embodied the standards that the Supreme Court announced in Justice Kennedy's decision for the court. And so we didn't think the 2013 rule really suited. The prior administration then proceeded to rescind that regulation and publish its own disparate impact regulation in 2020, which also contributed to dismantling the federal government's capacity to enforce the Fair Housing Act. So on the 25th of June, HUD published a proposed rule, and they are proposing to restore the definition of disparate impact in federal regulations that had been included in 2013. So we continue to have the same sets of issues now with this definition as we did back in 2013. And what we've advocated is the department explicitly include the standards that Justice Kennedy announced in the Inclusive Communities decision in its regulations about the meaning of disparate impact. Comments on the disparate impact rule will be due on August 24th, and that also can be submitted electronically at regulations.gov. And of course, we'll be preparing a letter and submitting a letter with our concerns. Our concerns mainly will probably be twofold. First of all, HUD's definition includes policies and practices that predictably could create disparate impacts, which is beyond the standards Justice Kennedy announced. And secondly, there's language in there concerning policies and practices that perpetuate housing segregation. It's not at all clear what that means. So for example, if a public housing development is located in a predominantly in a neighborhood that's predominantly occupied by members of a protected class, let's say a particular race, would improving and maintaining that property perpetuate segregation? It's unclear. So we're concerned about that kind of language in the disparate impact standard HUD proposed, and that language was not included at all in the Supreme Court's ruling or the opinion that it published.
All right. Thank you, Jim. David, did you want to make a point on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to really reiterate what Jim had said about collaborating with your local jurisdictions, even outside of whatever is decided about what assessment requirements are going to be there. I do get, the tone and the indications from HUD in a number of areas about how they're going to be looking at addressing racial inequities in the capital fund, whether in Section 3, in any of these areas. They're really looking at collaboration. They would say that they understand situations are different locally, and so they're going to be looking for what are those local assessments and plans to address them, whatever the details are, the requirements. I do think HUD will be looking at those collaborations pretty carefully in assessing compliance and enforcement. So just wanted to.
Can I add just one thing? Let me run down. There are 3 standards that Justice Kennedy wrote about, and so I've talked about this a bit. Here they are. In order for a disparate impact claim to work, there has to be a direct causal link between a policy and practice and a disparate impact affecting a protected class under the Fair Housing Act, number 1. Number 2, the policy or practice must be artificial, arbitrary, and unnecessary, according to Justice Kennedy. And number 3, the policy and practice cannot serve any legitimate interest of the entity that's established that policy or practice. So those are the 3 standards we're interested in having HUD include in its regulation.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. I actually now will turn to David Weber. David came from the Pittsburgh Housing Authority a couple of years ago to FADA, and Pittsburgh is a moving to work housing authority. So David has some real expertise in this issue, and he's working on correspondence now that the FADA leadership determined was necessary. It relates to the expansion of the moving to work program and a change that HUD recently made in that expansion. So David, would you just take a few minutes and elaborate on FADA's concerns about that particular issue and what that is? You're on mute.
Yes, thank you. I apologize for being on mute. Yeah, so HUD recently rescinded the invitation for what they called cohort number 3 work requirements. And this is really a concern for a lot of our members and our leadership, and we're working on correspondence to raise those concerns with HUD and our disappointment. And I think there's 3 sort of categories of concerns with more specifics beneath each one. One is that, this cohort number 3 on work requirements would continue ongoing research. There's been a lot of research around rent policies and various kinds of work requirements or work incentives. And it is part of the statutory goals of the Moving to Work demonstration. And this would have been the most rigorous, would have used controlled randomized controlled trial methodologies to really see what the impacts of policy related to work requirements would be. The second is that there's been a lot of work done on this that we're going to miss an opportunity to build on that work, whether that's the work done by HUD. There is a research advisory committee for the MTW expansion, which had a lot of discussion about how to do this in a way that could both meet the research requirements and wouldn't put tenants at undue risk. As well as individual agencies that have been preparing the applicant there to apply and doing some of the public process that's required. And I think the third category is that the risks that people might associate with a work requirement are largely addressed through the robust public participation and planning requirements for each MTW activity that the agencies have to go through at the local level. Those policies have to be approved by their boards as well as HUD. And there are tenant protection services that are built into that. And HUD had a framework and a timeline that involved 2 to 3 years of preparation by tenants and agencies before any new policy could go into effect. We think it's a little bit, we'd really like them to reconsider. And the other thing I would point out is that even though this cohort was called work requirements, there are a lot of other activities out there that have similar impact or could have similar impacts. And we need to compare them, even though those other things aren't called work requirements.
Right.
In Pittsburgh, we were trying to figure out how to incentivize people to work, but we didn't want to say, oh, you have to work or you're going to get evicted. So we said, well, if you're not in an exempt category and you're not working, and not participating in an FSS program and not pursuing education, we're going to charge a higher minimum rent. So is that a work requirement? I mean, even they're moving forward with cohort number 2, which looks at stepped rents and tiered rents, which also could have negative impacts on tenants. So we think it's, and it would be interesting and useful when looking at policy. The moving to work demonstration is supposed to innovate and test policies, which can then be rolled out to all agencies. It would be useful to know how a strictly focused on rent policy change might have a different impact than something focused more on the activities of the participant.
Well,
so we're very concerned about this, and we'll be communicating that to HUD. We're not real hopeful that they will change their decision in this manner, but we will share our concerns, and some of our members are part of the research advisory committee. I'm sure they will be sharing their concerns as well.
Well, and Arlene and Jonathan and I have already met with Senate Appropriations staff, who have, some of whom have said they're bitterly disappointed about HUD's decision on this. So we may be able to effectuate some change. I hope we can. I would note too that our new president, David Northern, feels very strongly about this issue because he ran a very successful moving to work program along these lines when he was at the Champaign, Illinois Housing Authority until very recently. He and I were talking just yesterday at length about the successful self-sufficiency work incentives that Champaign has in place. And he's disappointed because he wanted to implement similar program in Birmingham, which he just went to. So this is why he's so interested, and other members of FADA's leadership feel the same way, that this was included in the work, it was included in the MTW expansion, and HUD should move forward with it. So we'll definitely try to see if we can get this situation corrected. But stay tuned on that. Next, voucher expansion.
I see Arlene. I was just noticing Arlene had.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Arlene.
That's okay. Okay, well, just if we have a quick second, I thought the audience might want to know that we did ask why HUD did this, and we were told because the pandemic doesn't present a good time for people to be moved into employment. The opportunities aren't as vast as they might be in another time. But then people within our own organization pointed out this was going to take several years to roll out. And you also heard that the administration is opposed to it, and that it's not probably going to come back in 2 years either. So I just thought that would be of interest to people.
No, that's a good point. Jim, did you want to add something on this?
I just, David, to the best of my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, although they've removed work requirements from sort of the research package, an agency that gets MTW designation could work to include with HUD things like you talked about. It just wouldn't be subject to a national research project.
Yeah, they potentially could. Many of the original agencies have done such policies. On some of the other cohorts, as long as it didn't interfere with the research that was defined, they could pursue that. And then there is the cohort number 5, which has not yet really been clearly defined. One of our, it's been a long time, the expansion statute was passed in 2016. And now they're, if they're going to reevaluate and pick some other policy change, it's going to take a couple of years to figure out what that research would be. And we don't want to drag this out any longer. The other thing I would mention is that, this sort of issue around work and housing assistance has been a sort of a political debate for decades. And there's not a lot of real definitive research on how those policies impact tenants. And this would be the most rigorous research to date if what was outlined for cohort number 3 would have been the most rigorous research to date on this question. And we think it would be useful to continue to do that and get some data on those results.
So David, it's a missed opportunity is what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, the next topic we want to talk a few minutes about is voucher expansion. You're no doubt hearing and reading a lot about this topic. Linked to this webinar again is an industry position statement on making the voucher program, quote, universal. Perhaps ultimately making the voucher program an entitlement program. And that is a voucher goes to everyone who's eligible. So Jonathan, can you talk just briefly a little bit about what the Biden budget proposes and what the administration's philosophy is? And then also what kind of hurdles would a vast voucher expansion potentially face in Congress?
Okay, is that part 1 of the 2-part question, or is that the whole thing? Just so I frame my answer.
You answer however you want.
Okay,
Jonathan.
like most politicians in Washington, D.C. do. Okay, great. So thank you, Tim. As Tim said, FADA collaborated with CLAFA and our own MTW collaborative on a joint statement supporting expansion of the voucher program. As you can tell from the presentation, FADA believes that addressing the affordable housing needs of low-income households requires substantial and sustained investments in both tenant-based and project-based programs. In other words, it's prudent to have both supply side and demand side affordable rental housing assistance. Before going further, I think it's important to draw a distinction between the fiscal year 2022 budget and appropriations process, with Arlene and Tim spoke about quite a bit, from another track on the infrastructure bills, which will include housing, potentially through the Senate using the budget reconciliation process. So now to kind of directly answer Tim's question about 2022, as Arlene noted, President Biden's budget had 200,000 incremental vouchers in there, and then the House HUD subcommittee markup lowered that to 125,000 incremental vouchers. Without going into great detail, these vouchers are for homeless or those fleeing domestic violence, as well as providing mobility-related supportive services to those families to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. I'm going to cover a couple of the other bills that are in play as it relates to voucher expansion, but we are going to be providing you more details on them in the coming weeks. So I'm going to go through them very briefly now. So we did the 2022, but in terms of a larger infrastructure bill and housing and potentially through the reconciliation process, there's also a bill from Senators Van Hollen, Democrat from Maryland, and Todd Young, Republican from Indiana, bipartisan, called the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act of 2021, S1991, and it provides, or would if enacted, 500,000 vouchers that include a broader population of eligible households than the ones I just mentioned in the 2022 budget, that include but are not limited to those who are homeless, fleeing domestic violence, and also to provide the same type of mobility supportive services. But the key thing there is 500,000 vouchers. Then Chairwoman Maxine Waters has a draft discussion bill titled Ending Homelessness Act of 2021 which has not been introduced yet. FADA is very grateful to Chairwoman Waters and the House Financial Services Committee and Subcommittee staff for their engagement with us around the overall purpose of the draft discussion bill, but also on the substance of and the specific language on each section of it. Again, there's very limited amount of time, so a thumbnail sketch of that bill is, and you've heard the numbers in terms of incremental vouchers previously. This one, by contrast, if enacted, would provide incremental vouchers starting in 2022 of 500,000 vouchers. And then starting in year 2023 to 2025, 1 million incremental vouchers. And the funding, as I just mentioned, would remain available until expended. And then from that point forward, it kicks into a full-on entitlement program where the guaranteed subsidies for all who qualify, starting in 2026 through 2030, would also follow the same progression from the 2022 all the way to 2030 that first prioritizes those who are severely low income, then to extremely low income, then very low income and low income households. There are so many other provisions of the bill, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip to the next bill. Go ahead.
Well, we have a written summary, Jonathan, but in thinking about the hurdles of a voucher expansion, I mean, the cost, right? What ultimately are we looking at that Congress would have to appropriate? Of course, if it's an entitlement program, it's on the mandatory side of the budget. That's a very steep hurdle, a high hurdle to clear that probably is not achievable in the short term. But, you know, what are we looking at as far as incremental costs for these expansions?
Well, let's see, let's do back of the envelope. If we're talking about $1 billion to do 100,000 vouchers, right? And we're looking at potentially, just call it 5 million vouchers in the first 5 years.
Yeah.
And you can quickly do the math if the numbers get very costly. I would not put anybody on the spot, but defer to you, Tim, and others, because the earlier conversations you had about the budget and limitations and slim margins in the House and Senate. If you want to elaborate on that in terms of what are the obstacles, I'm game on that. I do have after that, what are the things that FADA believes are necessary in any voucher?
Well, that's what I want to get to, because, you know, we don't have a lot of time, but Jonathan, you know, obviously FADA supports an expansion of the voucher program. It's a key legislative priority of the association. But as you and I read from one of our most informed members just this morning, along with any expansion of the voucher program, you have to fix certain things, because otherwise you're just going to have in some instances, a voucher issuance, a universal voucher issuance. It doesn't mean that you're going to have people able to rent up. So what are some of the fixes that you would identify that we need to push along with an expansion?
Great. Well, thank you for that. I've got a quick list. Exercise your prerogative as a chair to limit me, and I do.
You have 1 minute, Jonathan.
All right. So adequate housing assistance payment funding to fulfill the range of voucher program goals. Fully funding ongoing admin fees and special fees. That the fees and that the structures are fair and sound. The eligible uses and purposes of both the HAP and the admin fee in the emergency housing voucher program and emergency rental assistance program are things that should be added and made permanent. Increase property owners' participation in the programs, facilitating vouchers to live in areas of opportunity, and there are several definitions of that. Facilitate increased production, substantial modernization and preservation of affordable housing, improve FMRs, SAFMRs, and the HAP renewal funding inflation factor. Make sure the project-based voucher program is structured in such a way that continues to provide owners, developers, lenders, and investors with meaningful opportunities for production and preservation to take place, and more specifically, that the anticipated revenues through reasonable occupancy assumptions are met. Otherwise, the PBV program will be in name only. A distribution formula certainly makes sense to prioritize to those with the greatest need, but in the past and in the future, FADA believes that a fair share formula that represents a portion so that all communities and households with eligible populations do receive incremental vouchers each year instead of having to wait years down the road for that to happen. Ensuring the statutory integrity of housing authorities as eligible entities to administer the program.
Important.
Topic of consortia, consolidation, realization,
Right.
leave it voluntary and make sure that any terms and conditions, whether it's a multi-ACC consortia or single, one doesn't outweigh the other. Make sure MTW agencies must receive incremental voucher assistance and participate in meaningful ways. A reasonable physical standard on decent, safe sanitary housing.
All right, we get it.
Okay.
I want to just turn to Arlene, who's done a lot of work in the voucher program. Do you want to make a point on this, Arlene?
Very important to what Jonathan was alluding to, and we've said it all along, and I said it earlier on the admin fees. The audience should know that Jonathan and I did a deep dive into the budget, into the appendices, and found that there are no admin fees associated with the expansion of vouchers, either in the Biden budget or the House budget that just came out. So that's something we'll be raising. We raised it with some in Congress this past week, and we're told that HUD thinks there's enough money in the admin fee account that's in the FY22 budget, to cover that. But if you heard what I said, they're also telling us it's full funding or near full funding. So, well, full funding means for FY22. You can't then say, and this is also for those other vouchers, right? That's just for renewals. It's supposed to just be for renewals. So we're going to keep on top of that and make sure that the admin fees necessary are there for any expansion.
Yeah, and I would note, Jonathan mentioned Representative Maxine Waters' universal voucher bill. He's looking at that closely along with the other FADA staff. We'll be writing up comments and giving her our input on that. So look for more information in coming editions of our newsletter. I want to now move on to another topic. It relates to physical inspections. And we're glad to have Crystal Wojciechowski, who worked on this years ago for FADA. She departed and she's come back part-time and now is working on it again, Crystal. So, NSPIRE is out there, that new proposed rules, Crystal. I think it would be worth spending just a couple of minutes and reminding our members some of our chief concerns about NSPIRE and where that regulation stands right now.
Yep. So thank you. We've been advocating for physical inspections, particularly REAC inspections in the public housing program for decades. And I think NSPIRE is just the most recent iteration of HUD's goal to create one protocol for all of their programs. And so many of our concerns are things that you've probably heard before. We do have some very specific concerns for NSPIRE, which I'll touch on, but just to kind of review concerns we've had over the years, just consistent underfunding, which forces agencies to make tough calls related to what kinds of routine and capital maintenance they make on their properties. The subjectivity related to inspections, lack of qualified inspectors. In the past, UPCS had put too much focus on the condition and appearance of units as opposed to what actually provides an environment that is safe, health and safety related to the residents. And so most of our concerns do kind of fall along those lines. But I think, so most recently, we had submitted, or FADA submitted comments on March 15th to the proposed rule. And we had some pretty significant concerns related to tenant caused damages, which has consistently been as part of our comments and advocacy over the years. So at this point, we do not have the protocol. So while the department may be stating that they're focusing on health and safety and fairness, objectivity, and to create an environment where inspections can be replicable and possibly less complex. We haven't actually seen the protocol yet. So coming soon, we hope, is a protocol that we can provide comments on and get your feedback. But one of the things that was brought to our attention that we noticed and our members have noticed is that tenant caused damages has not been discussed. And so especially now with the pandemic and agencies have not been able to be in units for, almost or even longer than 18 months. It's hard for agencies to know what kind of repairs that they might need. And so those tenant caused damages should not adversely affect PHA scores in the future. And HUD at this point has not addressed that concern. And so it's something that's at the top of our list of priorities, and we will continue to advocate on that. And we had actually, FHADA had in our comments had provided, and just in general, Advocacy had provided some ideas and recommendations for how to solve this, including, and if a damage has not been reported or repair work is underway or in process, that housing authorities could provide documentation to substantiate that. And so that would not result in an infraction or points deducted from their score. So that's something that we continue to work on. The latest of NSPIRE is, again, we sent those comments in March. We're awaiting the protocol, which at that we will have very detailed comments once that comes to light, so that we can determine if, in fact, our shared goals with the department of objectivity, health and safety, replicable results are actually brought about by the actual scoring, which is the most important. Just another update. It's not exactly new, but the department did extend NSPIRE through October 2022. Right. So if you're a housing if you do have a housing voucher program and you'd like to apply, that is available to you. And as far as resources, we have an NSPIRE fact sheet that's on the chat box, and then also uploaded, or the link to our comments from March 15th are there.
Right.
And that's NSPIRE specifically. One thing I did want to pause, Tim, if it's a good time, to put up a poll, because another inspection related update, not specifically to NSPIRE, are that the department had announced increased inspections as of June 1st. And we had not been hearing from our members that they had been being contacted by the department. So we're really curious to see if your agency has been contacted by REAC to complete a physical inspection, and also what part of where your agency is located, so we can have an eye on that.
Yeah, I guess we can leave that up for a couple of minutes for people to complete. That is important information if you all can quickly fill that out. So Crystal, on NSPIRE, what I hear you saying is the devil is really in the details, and we just don't have the details. We don't know what the scoring system looks like or what the full inspection protocol is at this stage.
Exactly.
And have you heard any timeline, or has other FHADA staff heard a timeline? I seem to recall Ashley Sharif, the REAC director, at our meeting in May, saying it would be quite a few months before we see more scoring details, but maybe Crystal, you or other staff have some updated info on that. I'm not quite sure. Timing.
I think in what I had seen is the department, as usual, says soon, and we're not really sure what that means.
Soon. That could mean
could be 5 years from now.
Anytime between 2 months and 2 years, right?
Right, right.
So it's interesting. So most have not been contacted yet about inspections. We understand from HUD that they're mostly concentrating on what they've identified as problem properties. I think mostly in the multifamily programs, if I'm not mistaken. But if you are contacted and you have concerns about the inspection, please do contact Crystal or the FHADA staff and convey those concerns to us. This is very helpful information to have. My understanding too is that for now, REAC is giving agencies 28 days notice instead of 14 days notice. And we've said, hey, REAC, you ought to make that 28 days permanent. It just gives agencies more time to plan. The 14-day turnaround is just too constraining. So we'll keep pushing that.
In addition, we had advocated to allow residents to opt out and to make FOS scores advisory through April 2022. So that's also a big win, especially as we navigate the post or, COVID, depending on parts of the country, that residents will feel safe and agencies have the opportunity to allow their residents to opt out.
I'm glad you mentioned that. The FAS and CMAP need to be delayed, probably even longer than HUD is planning. The more we look at things like declining tenant rental income and that effect on reserves and tenant account receivables and inspection costs and maintenance costs. So we're going to talk more about that in the coming weeks with the department. So with that, those are the topics we wanted to cover. Again, we had to do so fairly quickly, but you can consult the written materials that are linked to this webcast. Blake and Sarah Patterson, I think now we want to go to questions that the viewers may have. So I'm going to turn it over to Blake to lead us in, and then welcome any of the FADA staff. We'll use the hand raise function to answer those questions.
Yeah, so we are now opening it up to questions, and just as a reminder, please post those in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So our first question is, with the eviction moratorium ending soon, what's happening with the emergency rental assistance and voucher program, emergency voucher program?
So Jonathan, do you want to chime in on that, or other staff?
Other staff, please join in and I'll back you up.
Could not
Jen?
hear the end of the question. I'm sorry.
Sure, and this, again, some of these questions may have been addressed during the presentation, but I'd like to ask them again just to make sure that people who've raised them do hear their answers. With the eviction moratorium ending soon, what's happening with the emergency rental assistance and the emergency voucher program?
Okay, Jonathan.
All right, I'll take a stab at, so folks who've been reading the news clips that get sent around bi-weekly from FADA undoubtedly have seen headlines from around the country about the very slow rate of checks being cut to property owners and tenants to help with the rent arrears and utilities. And simultaneous, as the question implies, the eviction moratorium, federal one anyway, is coming up for expiration at the end of the month. It's very different states to state. But that's a bad scene, I guess, as they would say in the 60s. And part of our purpose here is not right necessarily during the webcast, but going forward, any feedback that you have. First of all, do you know that your federally assisted households are eligible for those programs on rent arrears and utilities? And if so, we provided some materials in the resource section on that so that you can go straight to the source. But any feedback you have about that program or the emergency housing voucher program, where we can provide, let's say, a liaison or conduit between what's not working and needs to be reformed with HUD and the Treasury Department and Congress, we welcome the opportunity. And if anyone else wants to add other things, please feel free to do so.
No, you covered it.
Okay.
So I have a specific question, and then I'll get to David. So, we've been talking amongst one another and talking with our members about serious concerns about residents losing their jobs, right? Or seeing declining tenant income, coming in for recertifications. This resulting in, and with the eviction moratorium, of course, we're reading and hearing about increased tenant account receivables in the public housing program. And then when you start looking at that issue, there's all kinds of other related issues that have a ripple effect. You have rising TARs, you may have declining reserves as a result of that. Ultimately, your occupancy rate could be affected. All of these are reasons why FAS needs to be delayed, FAS scoring, because these are things right now housing authorities can't totally control. But you alluded to this, Jonathan, residents are eligible for that emergency funding, right?
Absolutely.
But it varies by state, correct? So,
Well, the
what
eviction.
would-
Go ahead. No, I apologize.
what should, if I'm a PHA and I have, problems with all these things, and I'm seeing the declining income and it's affecting my financial status, I want to advise my residents to avail themselves of this program, right? How do I go about that? It varies in different states, all the different states, correct?
Right. Yes. Well, one of the things in the related resource section is an article that Arlene Kahn wrote on this topic, which provides a nice framework for those who hadn't previously, had their tenants participate in this, and also a link directly to every grantee in every state that runs a program. That would be the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, so that you can contact them directly, as well as have your residents go to their websites and their portals to make sure that they've applied.
David wanted to make a point.
Yeah, I just wanted to, in terms of the emergency rental assistance, which came through the Treasury, those funds got awarded to states and many localities. Each of those jurisdictions then has to sort of stand up a program and they have a fair amount of flexibility to create their own rules. So there were two separate tranches of funding for that program. So in many cases, the first tranche of funding was already processed and spent, and they may be modifying rules. Some of that money may not even be available depending on your state or your locality. In other places, the deadlines may already be approaching even for the second set of funding. And I think Jonathan addressed the emergency housing vouchers, which is a more targeted area, but certainly assisted housing residents are eligible from a federal level for that, for assistance with their portion of rent, assuming that all rent adjustments were made. So, yeah.
So I was just going to say what David said, just to make sure the audience knows, it's only for the portion of the tenant share rent, but also utility arrears. It's important to say that because that's not often said. And just in case anyone out there hasn't heard of this program and you're wondering, while they are assisted tenants or residents or participants through the voucher program, because they're also eligible, it's because that share of their portion of rent isn't paid. And in the private market, these funds are available to cover the whole rent for people in the private market. So the tenant rent brings equity to how those dollars are dispersed between the private and the assisted market. And that's why your tenants are eligible.
Jim.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to put some anecdotal information about the magnitude of the problem. In the community I live in, Richmond, Virginia, the Housing Authority is reporting that about 10% of its residents are behind in rent payment. I have no idea how that compares to just standard everyday rent payment. I've also been watching information published by the National Multifamily Housing Council, and their rent collection reporting on a monthly basis is showing that rent collections nationally among their members is quite consistent with pre-pandemic levels at this point. For a while, it dipped down 2, 3, sometimes 5 points. But at the moment, their members are reporting rent payments at the end of every month up to 95% of rents charged. So rent payments and failure to make rent payments are probably all over the map.
Yeah. That's a good point, Jim. And I want to make a pitch to the viewers out there and our members. As I mentioned, FHADA has asked for a meeting with the department on this topic. It's going to occur at the end of July. And we're inviting some of our members to it along with our staff. And this is the topic: declining tenant income, TARs, and related issues. So I really want to make a plea. If you are having issues out there, like Jim mentioned, Richmond, please get in contact with any of us on the FHADA staff. even if it's just anecdotal information, data certainly would be more helpful. But really having that when we talk with the department, that kind of information would be most helpful. And in fact, if you've really got some good examples, we may ask you to participate in that discussion. It could really make a difference. This is something that we're trying to get out ahead of at FHADA because we anticipate that operating fund prorations could be significantly impacted. Certainly the Section 8 program could be impacted. And it could even have an effect on things like RAD as well. So please be in touch with us on this if you have any useful information. Blake, what other questions do we have out there? We have about 10 minutes or so.
Sure.
We're happy to take more questions.
So this one is what's happening with the second lawsuit on the operating fund?
The second lawsuit on the operating fund. So there's about 550 housing authorities that are plaintiffs in the FHADA lawsuit against the department. This goes back to what, 2012, I think. You'll recall that the department, when Sean Donovan was the secretary of HUD, instituted what I call a scheme to short fund housing authorities with what the department called excessive operating reserves. So at the time, the department said, if you have excessive operating reserves, you're not going to get your operating subsidy, or you're going to get reduced operating subsidy, and you'll have to use your reserves for your everyday operation. And FHADA took the industry lead on that issue. We said that was a violation of statute and the HUD regulations relative to the annual contributions contract. We sued. We won a first lawsuit in which $136 million in damages were awarded to 300 and some odd housing authorities. And then before the statute of limitations ran out, we invited other impacted agencies to participate. 500 plus joined the second lawsuit. We successfully sued the department on that. We won the case through summary judgment. We recently won a federal appeals court ruling, which unanimously said that the PHAs, that FHADA is right about the ACC. And that ruling stands as of now. However, the federal government, the Justice Department is the government's lawyer, has a number of months to make a decision about whether to appeal this decision. So we're waiting to find out what the government may do. The government can ask the United States Supreme Court to hear the case, or it can ask I think it's a 15 or 16 member full appeals court to issue a ruling, because the appeals court case was heard by 3 judges. That's the way they do the process. But the judges ruled 3-0 in our favor. So they have 2 appeal routes. We're waiting to hear what they may do. We're hoping that HUD and the Justice Department do not further appeal, and these 500 plus housing authorities get their damage. And this is directly tied to the annual contributions contract, which FHADA believes is a contract, and HUD has certain obligations that it has to abide by. It's a very important issue. So we'll be obviously reporting what happens as soon as we know relative to the government's appeal. So next question, Blake.
Yeah. We were told that there would be an updated Section 3 guidance. Is there any update?
David, do you want to cover that?
Sure. I guess the short answer is no. There's not any update at this time. There is further guidance. We're told it is still in the works, but we have no timeline at this point. I think, the suggestion for agencies would be make your best efforts to try to achieve those goals through whatever strategies you can. Document them, and we'll let you know as soon as that additional guidance comes out. We do have some additional resources on our webpage and links to the Section 3 session we did at the previous conference, has some examples from some agencies.
Our next question is how many public housing units could we support with $1 billion? And I believe Jonathan mentioned this before, but I'll turn it over to you.
How many public housing units could
Yeah.
we support with $1 billion?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I think you might have mentioned voucher. How many public housing units could we support with $1 billion?
I think we need a little more context to that question,
I
but
didn't ask the question, but I believe it's both substantive and rhetorical. So the $1 billion reference was in the House HUD Appropriations Subcommittee markup for 125,000 vouchers. Immediately thereafter, the member asked that question, saying, how many public housing units could we serve with that same amount of money? He makes a
Okay.
good point, because we believe in both a project-based form of assistance and tenant and base of assistance. So I think the person who asked the question made a very effective point rhetorically.
so his or her point is, I guess, that public housing could be more cost effective in certain areas in some cases. Yeah. Well, I would say that that's actually an issue that we've been talking about within FHADA. Josh Meehan and John Hodge, who are on our executive board, are from the New England area, and they've been working with others in New England on a affordable housing development initiative, which is very exciting, which we discussed very recently with the FHADA leadership. And I think they're right that we should be stressing the development of more affordable housing development. That is an eligible expense under the infrastructure proposal. One of the reasons we're so excited about this $40 billion in additional infrastructure spending is that it would help address the capital fund backlog, and it would also allow agencies at their option to develop affordable housing. So that's why I can't emphasize enough, please, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. Talk to your senators and congressmen and ask them to support this infrastructure package. Arlene?
Well, I would want the members to know too that at the HUD Secretary's hearing, it was said rather disparagingly, why should we support $40 billion for public housing when vouchers are more efficient and effective and people can use them right away? And she shot back, look, that's not really true. They couldn't all be used right away for a variety of reasons, including supply, and that the public housing units are there, and we owe it to the residents to fix them up and allow them to be lived in, and to put more units back online as a readily source of available housing. So I want the audience to know that it seems like the Secretary is really supporting the $40 billion, as are some of the members of Congress, who have, many of whom have their own legislation calling for the $70 billion. So
Blake, I think we may have time for maybe one more question. Are there other questions in the Q&A box, or
We have a couple.
Go ahead, Blake.
Sure. We have a couple of comments. We don't have any more specific questions that have been entered. So I'm happy to read those, or we can move on.
Okay. Why don't we? I know that Sarah Patterson wants to mention the upcoming legislative forum, which is just in about 2 months here in Washington in September. We are doing that meeting in person. I want to encourage all members to attend it at all possible. There's going to be a lot going on. So Sarah, do you want to just go through that?
Absolutely. We are looking forward to the 2021 Legislative Forum that will be held September 12th through the 14th in Washington, D.C. Registration is now open on the FHADA website. During your time in DC, we encourage you to meet with your representatives on the Hill. And reaching out now is ideal to allow enough time for scheduling. Scheduling procedures vary by office and are often done either via their website or by calling the office directly. If you have a contact at your local office, they can often help to arrange a visit at the DC office, or you can reach out to the DC office directly. You may get an initial response that the congressional buildings are closed to the public, but we have heard across the board that many representatives are willing to take in-person meetings at their offices. So just kind of push for a second opinion on that. And we do encourage you to, when you make your request, mention that you are a constituent, give some background about your housing authority and why you would like to meet with your representative. If you don't hear back in a couple weeks' time, feel free to call the office to follow up directly. So they do get a lot of requests. Again, some of the buildings are closed to the public, so you may need to be escorted into the building, and there may be a limited number of people that can join each meeting, but just work with the scheduler to determine those parameters. These face-to-face meetings are extremely important to convey your needs at both a local and national level. And we really encourage you to share stories, like was mentioned earlier, of how legislation or funding is really impacting or will impact your residents and your housing authority. Those are extremely valuable to the representatives and their staff as they push for different funding and legislation. We will be doing a legislative briefing at the conference that will prepare you for some of those meetings, and the FADA staff are always open and available for any questions and assistance in advance. And we look forward to seeing you in Washington, DC.
Thank you, Sarah. Blake, you want to close that out? I think you want to mention the survey, right?
Absolutely, yes. So this does bring us to the conclusion of today's special current events briefing webinar. We'd like to thank everyone for attending today and for your questions. And we'd also like to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be available on FADA's website, along with links to all of the handouts that we've offered here today. And finally, in a moment, you're going to be directed to taking a brief survey, and we sincerely appreciate your feedback on ways that we can improve our future webinars. And with that, we come to an end. We'd like to thank all of you for attending today.